when we start talking to people about veganism, it immediately becomes framed as one of personal transformation. And so the person's defenses and posture is going to be very different than if, say, we move that conversation to a civic frame. Their biggest objection is going to be, if I change, it's really not going to change that much. But when we shift it to a civic frame, we give them the opportunity to take action on shifting to a plant-based food system while they're doing whatever personal work they need to be doing. They can actually get involved in the democratic process, having a voice in our food system in the direction that we need to be going in.
Hey, Robert, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Jamie?
Yeah, really good. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to have you a guest on sentientism. I've long admired the work of Free From Harm, often use in particular your collection of stories about farm transformations as well. So it's great to get to talk to the man behind that organization. And it's wonderful to hear you've also been a listener of the Sentientism podcast too. So it's great to have you as a subscriber and now to add you to the guest list.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm glad I discovered it on, I think it was on X, when something that you published, and it just triggered my memory to get in touch with you.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. So as a subscriber, you know this already, but I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions. And the first, in a common sense way, I frame as what's real? How should we understand this crazy universe we all share? And there are so many different alternatives to that, of course, but just as important are the questions of ethics, the questions of what matters and who matters, and their implications for how we can try and make a better future. These are the central questions we ask. And I have an obvious bias, which I'll state up front, because I'm trying to popularize and develop sentientism as a really broad, pluralistic worldview that suggests, when we think about the what's real questions and how should we go about working out what to believe or what credences to have, we should, very broadly defined, use evidence and reason, engage honestly with reality to try and understand it, with a healthy dose of humility and doubt always thrown in, so we can retain an open mind. And when it comes to the ethical questions, it's very pluralistic about how we might address the problems of ethics and the difficult trade-offs that we have to face. But it does insist that our moral scope should at least include all of the sentient beings, all the beings that have the capacity to have experiences, to feel, to experience, any being that can value their own lives, their own selves. And because they value that stuff, we should too. So hence sentientism, I summarize in a sentence as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a dazzling variety of minds and people, so some of whom agree with that philosophy and many of whom don't. So it'd be interesting to explore your own philosophical journey, where you are now on those big questions and how that plays into the work you do today. But before we get on to those crazily big philosophical questions, how would you best introduce yourself for those who don't know you?
So I'm an author, activist, and speaker. I represent Free From Harm. I'm the director of Free From Harm, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance a plant-based food system and challenge the dominance of animal agriculture through bold and innovative grassroots action. That's, in a nutshell, what we attempt to do. And we've been going since about 2009, when I started things out with Free From Harm, and we've branched out in lots of different directions, and started out as mainly a kind of an online presence. That was our goal, to build a strong online presence with a lot of solid content from different contributing authors, and really kind of leverage social media and just create this kind of online presence, which we did for several years. And then that kind of evolved into getting really much more on the ground kind of activism, and really kind of, the digital world is incredibly important, but it's not going to make the change on its own. And I started to really get...
So you mean my tweets aren't going to fix all the world's problems?
Well, they'll be a big part of it, I'm sure. Sure, what you're doing is a big, important part of things. But yeah, I just started to really feel the need to, as I started to learn more about, social movements and how they some that succeeded and some that didn't, and really, getting kind of geeked out on all of that stuff, I started to realize that, yeah, we had to go in a different direction.
Yeah. And it'll be fascinating to explore what that direction is. And yeah, as we talk about how to make a better future later on, because that's what you're trying to do. So thank you for that intro. Let's start with the first of these deep philosophical questions, the what's real question. And epistemology, the thinking about how to know is such a broad space because it covers every field of belief that we might have. But often an interesting way into the topic for my guests is to explore whether they grew up originally in quite an agnostic, atheistic, scientific-minded, naturalistic context and family, for example, or one that was maybe more spiritual, more supernaturally influenced, more religious, and how that side of their thinking is changed over their life, if it has, on how to work out what's true and some of those essential deep thoughts about the nature of the universe. So you can wind the clock back to tell the story as far as you're comfortable.
Oh, yeah. I guess it would go back to my father passed away at a very young age, and I was 10 when he passed. My experience with my father, I think, in the prior years really kind of shaped me in terms of he was a real creative kind of person, was in a jazz group at one point, dabbled in painting. We still have a lot of his still life paintings. He was an architect. He had a library in the basement, and his collection of books always fascinated me. And he had all kinds of stuff that was, I guess, probably popular in the 50s and 60s in terms of like thinking and ethics and, that kind of stuff. And so that kind of stuff really influenced me. And I'm thinking, yeah, he was a non-believer. He was not a spiritual person. And then he passed away. And then my mother, who was not a religious person or anything, I feel like my upbringing wasn't incredibly interesting, to be honest. It was pretty middle class. It was pretty standard. Although I was definitely an outsider. I could sense that from early on, that I didn't really fit into any kind of cultural trappings or groups at the time. And I was just kind of somehow wasn't sure where to fit in. So I always have had that sense of I'm kind of an outsider, and I'm okay with that. Now I kind of embrace that. When I was a child, it was a troubling thing to deal with, but now I embrace it because I feel like, it's the thing that causes me to question and want to change and not be stuck in a certain way of thinking, being open to new ideas and skepticism, and thinking, well, yeah, maybe we need to change course because maybe what we're doing isn't working so great. So I feel like it's a strength to have that. I feel like that's one of the things from growing up that I feel I'm glad I experienced.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a tricky balance because there's a degree to which if that feeling and that sense goes too far, it can lead into some dangerous places. It can lead into, conspiracism or, fields of misinformation and disinformation or epistemic black holes or flat eartherism or whatever it is, right? So there's, and it's frustrating in a way because while some of those spaces might be misguided or might even be dangerous, there is still something about intellectual curiosity and a boldness in many of the people who follow that path, which in a way sort of adds to the tragedy. But at the same time, there's something so important about maintaining that mindset because when you look at our modern societies, different places around the world, it absolutely makes sense to stand outside of those and be a bit of a weirdo and challenge them because there's some really awful stuff that goes on, right? So, but sometimes that can be quite a tricky balance, I think, about not being reactionary and, against the mainstream just for its own sake, but being against the mainstream where the mainstream genuinely is wrong and where you've got a good evidence base to persuade you. I don't know what you think about that sort of achieving that balance, but
Yeah, well, I think as it relates to social movements and change, it's very much an asset because it is those types of people that tend to be the catalyst for the change before people see that a change is even needed. And sometimes it's a small group of people that sense an injustice, that see an injustice that mainstream society doesn't yet. And that's the role of activism to me, is that awakening and triggering of popular support an injustice or for a truism, a real situation that society is not recognizing, is ignoring.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Agree.
in that sense, I think it becomes a catalyst for change. And yeah, there's a dark side, I'm sure. Fortunately, I haven't had that dark side hit me. So it's been a pretty positive
Yeah.
quality in my life. But
That's partly why I think this epistemological question is so important, because in a way, I think that's what provides us with the safety net. Because to my mind, what arbitrates the difference between, am I being an outsider and against the mainstream just because I don't like the mainstream, or am I actually an activist who is leading society in a positive direction, often does come back to, well, who does the evidence support? And in a situation where someone is, for example, a flat earther, I think the evidence, if you look at it honestly, is pretty strongly supporting the mainstream view that the Earth is a slightly lumpy spheroid, right? So in there, I'm quite comfortable based on a balance of the evidence that that person's gone off the rails, right? And is being reactionary for other reasons. Whereas if you look at something like, mainstream public views on animal agriculture, I'm very confident that you and I are activists with the evidence backing us, leading society in a positive direction, even though many people would look at us and think we're outsiders and weirdos who've lost the plot. So I think that's partly why I think this epistemological question is so important, because if it's done honestly and it's done right, that ultimately is the difference. It's not just a popularity contest. Ultimately, the evidence and good quality evidence and good quality reasoning hopefully should play through. And how would you describe your worldview on that front now? Are you a sort of non-religious and broadly naturalistic as your father was, or have you gone on a journey where you have explored some aspects of the supernatural or the spiritual or the transcendent, or something else that might go beyond that? Or you are boring straight down the line naturalist like me?
yeah, I want to deal with, I feel like that we have so much to deal with here that I don't have time for that stuff. I really don't. And I don't mind talking about it, and I certainly respect people's interest in it. I think I've dabbled in it throughout my life and had interests in some supernatural stuff for sure. But I just don't, I'm not seeking it out at this point in my life. I feel like I'm too engrossed in what's really happening. And the here and now and what we have to deal with is kind of, to me, all consuming.
Yeah, yeah, completely. I'm with you. Well, let's come on to the second of those big questions, which is about what matters and the fundamental questions of ethics. And for someone like you or me with a more naturalistic grounding, particularly when you grew up with that in the first place, it's quite interesting to say, well, what are the foundations of your ethics if such things exist? Because if you don't have the Quran or the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or some other sort of external reference or a culture or tradition which tells you what matters and who to follow and who to obey, often in many cases, it's quite interesting to explore, okay, what do good and bad and right and wrong even mean? So again, you can sort of wind the clock back, and if you had sort of formative thoughts about that stuff as a kid as you were growing up, what do you think good, bad, right and wrong meant then? And what do you think now, if there are foundations to your ethics, what's at the root of them?
I think experience has shaped my, my ethics or sense of right and wrong from, especially from a child who, experienced loss and saw, my father suffer with cancer for a couple of years before he passed away. And
That must have been so hard to go through as a kid as well at that age.
definitely, yeah. And so I think I developed a sense of empathy. And maybe that was part of it, but I don't know. Some people think that we have certain personality traits from birth, and we're empathic by nature, or that develops from experience. To what extent, those two, I don't know. But I do feel like some of those experiences, those life-changing kind of experiences I had as a child, definitely informed, me as more of an empathic person. But the irony, I guess, to that is that I didn't really come into an understanding of of the suffering of other animals and other species until much later in life. And unfortunately, that realization didn't really hit me until, late 30s, early 40s.
Yeah. And that empathic sense, I think, is a really common and really important moral motivator that I think, most people share to some degree. And I'd argue many non-human animals share as well. I think that's, it originated long before humans existed, that certainly mammals, and depends on the reproductive strategy, but there are many non-human animals long before we arrived that cared for their offspring, and their offspring cared for them, and even cared for other members of groups in an emotional, quite visceral way. So it makes sense that we would share that too. But it's quite interesting because it's not the only route into these moral foundations. Some people do feel it is like an emotional thing. For other people, they actually feel less of that to varying degrees, but their motivation is more of a sort of technical philosophical argument. So it might be about justice or fairness or some other construct which intellectually feels right to them, but they don't necessarily feel it tugging at the heartstrings in the same way. But it's quite, your answer is pretty clear, right? There's a sense of felt empathy there that I guess is that foundation. And this is a weird question to ask, but sometimes there's a sense in which empathy is like feeling what others, or sympathy certainly is feeling what others feel, and empathy, I guess, is caring about what they feel to some degree, and then compassion is being motivated to do something about that. But within all those feelings, there's a sense that what I'm feeling in my head mirrors what I think someone else is feeling. And even there, it feels like there can be a differentiation, because some people, I think, are driven by their own feeling. It's like, they see someone suffering and their own feeling is the motivation. Whereas there's a different flavor of it where it is genuinely, my concern for them, rather than the fact that their suffering is making me feel bad.
Right. Or if I could see myself in that situation, I wouldn't want that. I would want to do something. I would hope someone would be there to help me, that kind of sense.
And I think there's different flavors of those, and I don't necessarily think any are better and worse, but it's interesting that there's a different flow. But you brought me beautifully onto the next question, which is who matters? So I think many people would agree that there's this sense of empathy that is important to our morality, just caring about others for some reason. But one of the deep problems we have is that often that empathy or that compassion or that moral consideration is brutally selective and very restricted. And it's quite interesting because sometimes the people who have less emotional connection to an ethical problem, and theirs is more technical, they're like, I want to maximize utility, or I want to apply rules that are consistent, or I want to grant rights, or I want, justice. Quite often the more intellectual approaches are, if anything, better at really broadening the moral scope, because it is about fairness. So why would we exclude anyone? Whereas sometimes there's a risk with maybe the more emotional or more care-focused ethics. And obviously there's the whole field of feminist care ethics, which tries to, formalize this, which can be a bit more restrictive, because those emotional reactions are triggered by often people close to us, like us, near us. And sometimes people can struggle to extend the emotional empathy because of beings we've evolved to be in a much more generous way. So I should ask a question. What was your journey in expanding that moral scope? How did you start out, and how did that broaden over time? And I'm interested in particular, given your comment, how did you come to think about non-human animals, and how and why did you start to incorporate them into your moral thinking?
Well, I think when I came to realize what the real conditions were for those animals that suffer in our food system in particular, I realized that their suffering was like our suffering. I mean, you could just sense it.
And how did that come about? Did you experience that personally in a farm or something else, or was it a leaflet or a video or something more remote that helped you see that?
I came across it through some documentaries and investigative footage. At the time, I think Mercy for Animals was 7 people or 6 or 7 people in Chicago. and they were doing this kind of interesting, daring undercover investigative stuff in farms. Not that it was the first time it was ever done or exposed before, but that was their big thing. And I started to learn about, they were local. So I started to learn about what they were doing and connect with some of those people. And
Why do you think you even started to engage with that? Because I think the default human response to seeing that stuff is either, that's just a crazy edge case, bad apples, that's not the farming I buy from, and then you disconnect. Or it can even be just such a visceral disgust that you basically cut it out of your brain and walk away and just deliberately never engage with the topic again, right? So what was going on in your head that made you actually want to find out more and engage?
well, so it was a process of questioning because, of course, we think that there has to be somehow this has to be wrong. Somehow there has to be other options, other solutions, so that maybe there's maybe these humane claims, maybe this humane, sustainable type of farming is really the way to go. And for a couple of weeks, I thought I could believe in that, but then I quickly learned that those were empty marketing promises. And having been someone in marketing myself, working even actually on food, some food industry accounts, I got to see behind the scenes how we manipulate, how that industry, advertising and marketing industry manipulates our minds to create these fantasies about food and so many other things. And so I already had that skepticism because I already knew that, kind of having been a bit of an insider in that industry. So I was already pretty skeptical. And I guess, yeah, I felt really ashamed about, just not really being open to this information and reality sooner.
Thank you. And I'm interested in what you think about. So one of the challenges that people make to this sort of sentientism stance is they say, look, you're not going far enough. And in fact, some of the first times the word was used was to criticize this way of thinking and to say, look, in a way, this is another form of discrimination because you're discriminating against stuff that isn't sentient. And they would suggest that actually we need to have an even more generous moral scope that goes to biocentrism, where you would care, for example, about the plants behind you, even if they're not sentient. They're living, they're probably not sentient, but we should care about them directly as moral patients. Or even beyond that, to an ecocentrism, which is a pretty common claim in the popular discourse now, given environmentalists, that we should care about rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, the earth as Gaia. We don't think they're sentient, and many of those things aren't living, and some of them are just abstract concepts, but we should care about them as real moral patients in their own right too. Whereas your empathic connection that you talked about, to my mind, links quite neatly to sentience because you are anticipating the feeling of another being that can themselves feel. So the idea of empathy and compassion linked to this idea of sentient beings because we're feeling and anticipating and caring about what they value and what they feel. I'm very open-minded about biocentrism and ecocentrism, and I care about all that stuff too, but I care about it instrumentally because it's so important. Our shared environment is so important to all of us humans and all of the quadrillions of sentient beings, but I don't care about a tree or a rock or a river in the same way as I would a pig or a fish, because I don't think they can experience things. They can't feel things. They can't be harmed in that same moral sense. But what do you think about going beyond sentience, beyond the animal realm in terms of moral thinking? Do you do that, indirectly or more directly, that you think we should be even more generous?
Well, I think there's a bit of a conflation out there between someone being a moral patient and having respect for beautiful rocks or not beautiful rocks or rivers or mountains, that of course we revere these elements of nature. And if you have a respect for animals, it's hard not to have a respect for nature and see the beauty and want to preserve it and want to relish it and want to be a part of it, really, because we've lost connection with it. That's very different, though. That's a very different sentiment to want to protect nature than what you're talking about in terms of the qualities of a sentient being and the kind of requirements and obligations we have to someone that has sentience. And so, and there's obviously a broad spectrum of sentience. We're learning about different levels of sentience, which doesn't make things easier for us. It makes it more difficult as far as like answering that question, where do you draw the line, which people love to ask, right? It just means that we don't necessarily have to know where to draw the line. We can certainly protect and not harm those that we know without a shadow of a doubt are highly sentient, very complex social beings like chickens and turkeys and pigs and cows. And that doesn't prevent us from then indulging in the idea of where do we draw the line? Because to me, that's an indulgence. Like, yeah, we can spend the time on that, but let's not ignore the ones that are already known to be very, very sentient.
Yeah, the edge cases, might be intellectually fascinating, but don't use them as a distraction from the obvious core cases where there are egregious wrongs being done. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't make a big false equivalence and put everything into one basket of, like to try to blur the lines between very, highly aware, highly conscious animals and others that might be somewhat or not at all, but are beautiful and are plants or are rocks or whatever. And we can still admire them, but they're not, let's not create a huge false equivalency by lumping everything into one group. That would be, I feel like that's what some would like to do to kind of muddy the waters, to muddy the discussion about sentience.
That's the impression I often get. And there's, there are some reasonably good faith approaches to that. And then there are the Twitter trolls who are just using any excuse to try and chip holes in something they think is pretended to be perfect and never was. But I agree. I think there's this weird thing about the human mind that assumes for a concept to be meaningful, it has to be perfectly defined with a really crisply defined boundary. And it's like, good luck, because the only place you're going to find that is in mathematics, right? Where it's an artificially constructed formal system. And even many of the mathematical systems fall down on that. But if you're talking about concepts, right, they often just are fuzzy and they're indeterminate and there are edge cases. But like you say, let's not use that as an excuse for turning away from some of the obvious stuff. And there's also a bit of a danger that I think you're talking about too. If you go to this sort of super generous ecocentric approach that says, in a sense, everything matters, that feels generous and progressive, but there's also a danger of a sort of ethical flattening there, to the extent where people will, are you seriously suggesting that pushing a knife into a carrot is the same as pushing a knife into a pig because everything matters? And again, you've gone, and I love the way you put that. You can revere nature, you can want to protect it, you can enjoy its aesthetics, you can revel in it and think it's a wonderful thing, but that is distinct from it being a moral patient that has its own sense of its own life and its own experience and its own value. That puts it in a different category.
Right.
So the final big question is, how do we make a better future? So it's another easy one, but in a way, I think we've got a good grounding because we share this sort of broadly naturalistic approach where if we're going to try and make the world better, let's try and engage with it honestly to understand it. And that gives us a better chance of making it better. So that hopefully is a reasonably solid foundation. But then we've made our lives much harder because we care about much more beings. We care about all the sentient beings, which is a bit of a mind-blowing thing to do.
It's quite a burden.
It is quite a burden for us.
A moral burden.
Random evolved apes. So that's tough. But in that context, I'm interested in, firstly, whether you've got any sort of big picture thoughts about how we can make a better world. And you can go anywhere with that. That can be intrahuman ethical problems. It can be the challenge we've been talking about, how we treat and exploit non-human sentient animals. But yeah, I don't know if you have any sort of big picture thoughts, because then it'd be really interesting to drill down onto some of the campaigns that you're running on the ground now as specific examples. And I wonder if it might be a good place to introduce your farm to fable book, because I think part of that big picture story is about narratives and the stories humans tell ourselves and the stories we're told by industries and so on. But again, broad question, how do we make a better future?
The narrative discussion is an important one, and the messaging. And there's some interesting studies and work being done, I think, about that. And I think, the book, the Farm to Fable book, was really an attempt for me to somehow structure all of the justifications and all of the objections that society has about shifting to a vegan or plant-based life. And to me, for a while, it's a big fascination for me to figure that all out. And this is going back to 2013, 14, 15, when I was working on the book. And I got some help from people because I wasn't sure exactly how to structure all of these things, but I got some really good advice on how to, these are naturalistic fallacies, these are appeals to humane treatment, these are false dilemmas. So I got a nice structure for the book. That was the biggest challenge, I think. That's not the same as strategic narrative and how we use messaging. It's really just a kind of a way of trying to absorb all of the justifications and objections that our cultures have about changing, about leaving that part of our past behind us. And so that fascinated me for a while. I'm going to be honest, it doesn't fascinate me now, because I feel like I did that. And I'm not like saying I'm perfect at it, and there's still lots of ways to respond, but I'm really not interested in those one-on-one conversations anymore. I mean, I think for me, the important work is like, how are we going to change? How are we going to shift the power structure? Because that's really how social change happens. It's an analysis of power, who has it, who doesn't, and how does that shift? That's really kind of what I focus on, rather than how do we respond to someone who believes in the humane myth. I hope the book, I think there's a lot of interesting street activism that you see out there, popularized by like Earthling Ed, for example. And our movement is fascinated by these interactions one-on-one between somebody who's really good, like Earthling Ed, at dialogue and having some interesting responses, and this other person that they meet on the street. There's a fascination for it, and you can tell by the social engagement in these types of content, in this type of content. And so I think it's a value to learn how to have these one-on-one, but we have to look at, like you said, if we're going to look at the big picture, then how are we going to change systems and institutions? Then that requires an analysis of power and politics. And I'm not sure we're there yet. I'm not sure that there's enough interest in that or recognition that that's an important direction that we have to go in yet. And so when I started looking at other social movements, I realized that this is absolutely what we have to be. This is the glaring void in our movement right now, and that there's very few people working in this way.
Yeah. And in terms of that one-on-one dialogue and that style of activism, I think there is value in there. But in a way, I sort of share your frustration, because all of those arguments have all been had. There's not much new going on in there, because in a way, the philosophy and the facts are pretty obvious, right? They've all been laid out. And many people have written basically, pretty much the same books going over the arguments. We have these conversations, online all the time, or in the street all the time. And it's the same pattern and the same pattern. So there's not much new going on there. And I think, but the conversations also belie something which I think is sort of positive. And I feel this myself, which is a sort of naive hope that if we just explain it to people, the light will go on, because most people are good people, right? And most people can think. And if we just use per sentientism, right, you use evidence and reason, and we talk about needing for compassion for all sentient beings, the light will go on and people will change, and then we're done, right? And I like that. It can happen, and it does have an effect. And institutions and systems are made up of and driven by individuals. But it is also breathtakingly naive and incredibly slow. And it's partly naive because, as you say, it's not recognizing the reality of power and the reality of systems. So how has that recognition shifted the work that you're doing now? And I don't know if you want to pick out some of the examples from the campaigns you're running at the moment about, how you're trying to pull some of those levers.
Yeah, well, there's something that I'd like to just kick off with that I like from Pax Fauna, from Aiden.
I interviewed Ava from Pax Fauna quite a while ago as well, so she's a previous guest.
Yes. He talks about wanting to move people from a consumer frame to a civic frame. And I like that language. I think it's very helpful because it does capture what I think we're talking about in terms of the veganism being a word squarely framed in consumerism and my personal identity as a vegan or not being a vegan. So when we start talking to people about veganism, it immediately becomes framed as one of personal transformation. And so the person's defenses and posture is going to be very different than if, say, we move that conversation to a civic frame and say something like, instead of bringing up veganism, we say, don't you think that, with all the evidence, with all the benefits of a plant-based diet, from a public health and safety standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from an animal ethics standpoint, to avoid pandemics, you name it, all the great reasons why. Don't you think we should be transitioning to a plant-based food system, and that should be the direction we're going in, because that's probably the future. And it's also tied to other social justice struggles. And it's quite striking to see how many people will buy into that idea and actually do believe it, those that haven't transitioned to veganism or plant-based diet. But we're shifting the focus off of them personally, and we're saying, hey, okay, well, if I change, they're going to say, their biggest objection is going to be, if I change, it's really not going to change that much. But when we shift it to a civic frame, we give them the opportunity to take action on shifting to a plant-based food system while they're doing whatever personal work they need to be doing. They can actually get involved in the democratic process, having a voice in our food system in the direction that we need to be going in. So it's just a difference in what we focus on and how we frame things.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess that because one of the risks is that if they're not allowed to engage in the activism and the civic side until they've personally passed through the threshold of veganism, they're likely to just turn away from the entire topic. That's the risk. They might not. They might double down and come with us, but there's also a serious risk they just turn away. And I think this is a really difficult challenge, because many vegans would say, it's not just about consumerism. It's a ethical stance that is motivated by ultimately a sentientist compassion and or a right stance, or whatever it is. But they would say, look, veganism isn't about the humans. It's about the animals. It's about the victims. The focus should totally be on them. But it is difficult because in the popular discourse, veganism does end up feeling like it's all about the humans. It's either about the annoying vegans, right? I don't want to be a vegan because some vegan annoyed me. So, oh, that's convenient. You don't have to think about the animals at all, right? You just turned this into a group thing, and you don't like the group, so you're not going to join the group. Or, I don't want to become vegan because that feels like an identity I'm not comfortable adopting, even if I think animal agriculture and exploitation is an abject horror. I still don't feel comfortable with that identity. And even for advocates, we can, and I do this myself, like you can slip into it being a conversation about the human you're talking to, because it's all about their journey and why they haven't tried a plant-based milk yet, and whatever it is, right? But it's all about them as a human and their journey, and whether they're achieving the bar we're setting or not. Again, often unwittingly, even us vegans bring the conversation back to being quite centered on humans and human choices and human actions, rather than, what's the voice of the animals, and what would the animals really want us to be doing if we understood their interests deeply? What would they care about? So it's a tricky topic, because at the same time, I also share the nervousness of many vegans of us humans are so good with coming up with excuses and ways out, and dodging our hypocrisy and so on. So I recognize that, and I sort of appreciate wanting some sort of sharpness and clarity, the sort of sharpness and clarity we demand for intrahuman ethics, right? We would struggle to say, look, come and be an activism against homophobia while you're still being homophobic in your day-to-day life. We'd sort of be quite tough on that. We'd call it out. So I feel that tension as well. But at the same time, I think the practical reality, I do think that civic story carries more weight. And in practical terms, by engaging on that civic side and talking to people about those transitions and focusing on, the ethics of animal agriculture rather than the ethics of your choices as to whether to buy it or not, actually is more likely to change people's individual behavior in line with those values too. Because once you're engaged in that sort of civic process and that activism, you learn, you develop, you build new connections, and it maybe can free you up to have the confidence and to change your own consumption decisions too. As even if that feels like a side effect, ultimately that comes through as well. But
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that. And we're not, it's not necessarily a shift in focus away from animals or nature that we care so deeply about. It's not necessarily a shift in focus away from that. The shift is in giving people the hope that they have a voice in a process that they can understand, versus saying, well, we really just want to focus on you and your life and how you're going to change. We're saying that person's biggest objection will be, oh, even if I do change, it's really not going to make that much of a difference. But if I'm engaged in this campaign where we're really putting pressure on this farm bill congressperson who's going to make a huge decision that's going to affect billions of animals and millions of consumer choices, and where food will be available, at what cost, and who will have access to it, and all that, then all of a sudden there's quite a lot on the line there, and people will maybe surprisingly rise up to the challenge and want and feel like they have something important to contribute to that effort, rather than just having it being focused on their own dietary choices, which they will say, oh, it's really not going to make that much of a difference.
yeah, thank you. And I wonder, is the Farm Bill an interesting example of the sort of work you're doing at the moment? And I have listeners in the US, of course, but other places around the world. But I don't know if you want to give us a quick sort of 101 intro to what the Farm Bill is, why it matters, and what influence you're trying to have on it.
Right. So we look at the Farm Bill as an opportunity to get a certain message out there that we'd like to get out there. And so the Farm Bill is kind of an opportunity because it's in the news, it's timely, the media is interested in it, people are hearing about it, they know that they're getting ready to propose two different versions of the Farm Bill, one that's going to be more Republican in nature and one that's going to be more Democratic in nature. And it's an opportunity for us to insert our message into what is already a lively discussion that could potentially get media attention and build popular support from that. And we're not endorsing either Farm Bill, either version of the Farm Bill, because while there are there's many provisions in there that we would support, like better protection for workers and consumers, and environmental protections and forestry protections and tree planting programs, and they pile all kinds of different things in this, right?
It's a big beast, isn't it?
The problem is the overwhelming emphasis is on bailing out animal agriculture. And so long as that is the focus, it's by design, it's corrupted, it's spoiled, it's rotten, right? So that's what we want to focus on. We don't want to focus on being policy experts about the Farm Bill because, of course, the first thing they will attempt to dismiss you on is you're not a policy expert, you're not a lobbyist, you're not an analyst, a farm analyst, get out of here. You don't have a voice here. And that's exactly what we seek to debunk, that you don't have to be an expert. Anyone at any level of education in any class should have a voice in this important bill that will affect, the food we eat. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
And how are you trying to put that into place? Are you trying to drive a sort of centralized lobbying effort to drive that influence, or a PR effort? Are you persuading individuals to get active in their own way and write to Congress people and so on? What's the mechanisms you're using to try and have that, or get those messages out?
We're not lobbyists, and we're not playing that inside game. And I think there's a place for it. And I think there are fortunately some really good people on our side, on our team, that are lobbyists and that have an understanding of how the inside game works and how these bills are passed. And I think that's extremely valuable to have them on our side as allies. And at the same time, what we're trying to do is take a different approach, an outside game approach. Whereas we put pressure on the system from the outside, that we represent the grassroots, that we're not the professional class necessarily, and we don't feel that it's necessary for us to be attorneys, veterinarians, nutritionists, scientists, lobbyists to be included in this discussion. And we know we're not going to get in by invitation. And so that means that we have to make some calculated decisions about how we are going to physically insert ourselves in these spaces of power to have a voice. So that's the calculation that has to be made with the kind of people that are getting involved. They're realizing that calls and emails will be a good baseline. But then beyond that, where are we willing to escalate? How are we willing to escalate to make sure that our voice does get heard and factored in? So
yeah, so that adds in some direct actions into.
Right. That's what every movement faces. Ours is far less evolved than other movements, like, for example, like Black Lives Matter. And yet that calculation always has to be made about how if you're a nonviolent movement like we are, how are we going to engage with power holders and influence them, and get in front of them face to face? Because if we're not willing to do that, we can't expect to see any significant change.
Yeah. And from the interventions you've done so far around this, what sort of response are you getting, I guess, both from the policy people and the politicians themselves, but also wider press, public? How much challenge, how much support?
Well, it varies quite a bit. We had a really interesting interaction with, just to give you an idea of what the culture is like in when you go to Washington, you go to the Capitol building, and you start dealing with the elites and trying to influence them. So one kind of funny anecdote is we went to a press conference a couple of weeks ago, and Senator Debbie Stabenow, she's the most powerful person in the Senate working on the Farm Bill. She's the chairwoman of the Committee on Agriculture. And so she's coming up with the Democratic side of the Farm Bill, and she's the key figure for that. And so we go to this press conference, and we go in and we confront her directly. She's giving, a press interview with these agriculture journalists. And the only people in that room are people that are going to write favorably and report favorably on her policy, or favorable on agriculture, animal agriculture in particular. There's no one else in the room. And so it was a big surprise for them to have us suddenly come into the room and talk about the dark money that the meat, egg, and dairy industry is using to buy our elected officials to shape the farm bill into something that is nothing short of a big bailout, multi-billion dollar bailout. And so, of course, this came as a big surprise. It's just not being done, right? It hasn't really been done too much up to now. It's the last thing they were expecting. Well, one of the journalists in the room, who's also a chicken farmer and from Kentucky, a conservative state probably, but he's been a journalist for 40 years. And he asked us if we would come back in an hour after this press conference because he'd like to interview us. I wasn't there personally, but the people that we were working with there. So they did, and they came back. And one of the staffers for one of the Congress people was guarding the door with a stick, a huge stick, and said that we couldn't come in, and was quite threatening with the stick. And there were several Capitol Police officers there, many more than activists. And so even though we just used our voice, we were non-threatening, far from violent, non-threatening even in our language, in our presentation. They still look at the response to that was like a fight or flight kind of response, like, oh my gosh, we're being attacked, and this cozy situation is being kind of blown up.
Yeah, we thought we were amongst friends here.
Yeah. So that's a little tidbit of a kind of things you find when you start confronting this power structure.
And it's a fascinating setup, and I think is one of the great ways of understanding the sheer level of power the animal agriculture industry has. Because technically speaking, if you were to think across the political spectrum about how people would look at this, people more towards the left, you would think would be angry about the corporate capture of democracy and dark money and so on and so forth. But people further on the economic right, you would think would be outraged at the massive government spending, taxpayers' money in enormous subsidies. So you would think it's one of those topics where, at least technically, people across quite a broad range of the economic political spectrum will be like, we need to do something about this. But of course, that's not how the dynamics play out.
No, it isn't. And in fact, the establishment is the establishment on the Democrat or the Republican side. It's still the establishment. It's still going to protect the vested interests. And those vested interests in our food system are overwhelmingly the meat, dairy, and egg industries, their lobbyists, their trade groups, their analysts. And while we can't prove it because we don't have transparency, it's very likely that they are pretty much writing the farm bill, presenting it to the senators and the Congress people, and saying, this is what we want, and strong-arming them into advocating, becoming the spokespeople for this policy, this farm bill policy, without much resistance, because the public has no idea like how this runs. They know it's corrupt. They know, like, in kind of instinctually, that there's something very corrupt. But the amazing thing that I have learned is that, as daunting and intimidating as this whole situation is, I've seen a handful of activists, even just a handful, really have a major impact, a big impact. And if our numbers grew, I know that could become even stronger. And so lots of people say, well, we're such a small movement. We're so weak in terms of numbers. And I don't argue with that. But at the same time, so were the suffragettes. And so were lots of groups that started out very small. There were only a handful of people willing to do direct action, to go into the parliament, to confront police, to get the kind of attention that the news wanted to cover. To do that requires a little bit more of a sacrifice. And, as far as the media goes, that, for a long time, and I still see this, but for a long time, we thought the media is not coming to our events, no matter how good the press release is, no matter how many press pitches we send out, no matter how many content, even if we hire good PR people, agents to help us, they're connected, they're supposed to be able to get they don't come to our events. What you have to do is go to their events. Like, what are they covering? How could it be related to our issue of, food system change, and find opportunities to get in front of their camera and space and get a better chance of getting our point of view covered. So that's what we're doing. That's why we're going to press conferences and other places where we think the media might show up, like World Dog Day, and which is hosted by a big celebrity in Hollywood named Lisa Vanderpump. And she's a dog rescue advocate with millions of dollars to spend on rescuing dogs from the Chinese Yulin Dog Festival. And so we use that as an opportunity, not because we have anything against Lisa Vanderpump or her fans, but we knew the media would be there, and we knew it was an opportunity to get this message out. Hey, Lisa, extend your compassion to all animals. Dogs are great. We love dogs too, but you're calling the global meat trade an atrocity, and we agree with that 150%. We just need you to admit that all animals suffer in the global meat trade, and that you'll and you could do something very meaningful to put that into practice by transitioning your restaurants to plant-based menus. So yeah, and we knew going into that we were going to create a controversy, but by polarizing people in that way, you're asking them to take a side. And yeah, that's how people start feeling strongly about an issue, is when you polarize to get them to take a stance, an ethical stance on it. And the gamble is it going to work in your favor, or is it going to work against you, right? We'd like to believe that it works for us in the long run, because most people will side with justice and democracy and the victims of something.
And would want to have, at least at a basic level, a coherent, consistent ethics. I mean, we deep down, all of us want that, really. We don't want to have an arbitrary morality, I think. Yeah.
Right. Well, isn't morality about consistency? I mean, I always thought it was, but then again, with things going on around the world, it doesn't seem like lots of exceptions are made, aren't they, for like this group or that group, because, well, they don't deserve the same treatment. They don't deserve the same privileges as the rest of us because of something they did.
Yeah. It does seem to fall back into a more classic battle of just an attempt at a broad, general, universal moral concern versus in-group, out-group, or even, just a straightforward might makes right, I can do what I like if I have the power type dynamic, right? That's not something we've managed to suppress in the human spirit yet. So, and the other thing that's, again, if people don't already understand the power of the industries we're resisting, is that with many of the guests I've spoken to around the world, in some of their countries, quite a serious percentage of their population is actively involved in agriculture, and often animal agriculture. So there you can see the democratic challenge of working on a transition where, 20, 30, 40% of your population are actually, their livelihoods depend on agriculture. Now, where you are in the US, where I am in the UK, that is not the case, right? The percentage of people who work in agriculture, particularly animal agriculture, given it's been so, insanely industrialized, is, I don't know, probably what, 1%, 2%, something like that. So again, the idea that you can be in a country where almost half of the population will answer surveys saying, slaughterhouses should be banned or factory farming should be shut down completely, yet a group of people who, in terms of population size, is probably 1% of the population, can still drive this broad political consensus that something like the Farm Bill with its, billions of subsidies should drive this industry relentlessly forward is absolutely mind-blowing. Again, those lobbyists deserve their bonuses, right? just as they did when they worked for big oil and they worked for big tobacco before it. Absolutely mind-blowing success. Well done to them.
It's absolutely the catalyst for us to want to hold this system accountable and these people accountable. And if you look at the people on these committees that are, representing the Farm Bill, and it has to get passed through committee first to then go to a general vote in Congress. These people are all from agricultural states where their economies rely on, maybe not the numbers are there, but their economies rely on it. But they're mostly big corporations that are going to be recipients of this bailout money. And yes, you're right. To the fact that, but I hate to belittle them in any way, but they don't represent the vast majority of Americans and consumers at all. But of course, they have to frame it that this is going to benefit consumers because they're going to see lower prices. They're going to see more stable prices. They're going to see a secure food supply and things on the shelf that they want. Well, guess what? None of this trickles down. It's like the trickle-down effect that the Republicans have about wealth trickling down from billionaires to the rest of us.
Yeah,
the trickle-down theory is a myth. And the savings don't trickle down. The bailout money that the industry gets goes right back into investing in growth. It doesn't benefit consumers. And we have some, evidence and case studies of that we like to throw out there. But yeah, I can't wait to get in front of these people when they start negotiating the Farm Bill, to talk to them about this, and to call them out for enabling this really corrupt, dark money, special interest process that we say has to go. And some people will say, well, it's never going to change. You're never going to change things. You get a lot of that. About all social movements get that. But I think the response to that is, if you're not willing to fight for what you have in terms of freedoms and rights and privileges, you might as well kiss it goodbye, because every generation before us has had to fight for basic rights. It's always a struggle. It always probably will be. And if we think those rights and freedoms and democratic processes are important, then they're worth fighting for.
Yeah, complacency. We know where complacency leads, right? So you can see it in so many fields these days. Yeah, and the people who most want us to adopt a defeatist stance are the people who don't want things to change, right? Again, that's one of those powerful narratives that runs through and tries to undermine those who are driving positive change. Yeah, so thank you for being part of the story. Yeah,
and yet, sadly, it has really permeated our own movement too, where you have lots of people thinking that they can't make a difference, and the system is too entrenched and too powerful to make change. It's actually quite vulnerable to change and to being exposed because of just how corrupt it is. And we think the idea that hardworking Americans are paying the price for problems that the industry largely created on its own by virtue of how it confines and keeps animals, and that we're paying for getting rid of millions of diseased animals and replacing them at our expense. I think across the political spectrum, most Americans think that's crazy, that's outrageous. That that these industry lobbyists are buying off our elected officials to pass legislation to get us to pay for the messes that they created, essentially.
And I think that's to paraphrase where your optimism comes from. You're very clear about the power of the industry and its ability to influence, if not outright buy, politicians across the political spectrum. But there is this sense that we've got this latent public support, right? Where ultimately, if people could really see this stuff clearly, very, very many people would agree with us and probably agree with us already in theory. So if, brave, intelligent activists pulling on the right levers in the right places can help crack this open, things could change pretty quickly.
We need a trigger event where something big happens, and perhaps that will be bird flu when more workers get sick. But the interesting thing about that too, just as an aside, is I faced a panel a couple of weeks ago, officials from the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. And they were talking about how great they work together and how they really got a handle on this bird flu problem. And there's no concern, there's no cause for concern, and they're really working together. And so one of my questions to them, I did wait till the Q&A. I didn't disrupt them because I knew that they would give me a mic and then the whole room could hear me instead of just them. There were about 500 people in the room, mostly industry professionals. But one of the questions I asked was, the news reports are saying that the CDC can't even get into these farms to do the proper type of investigation that they need to do to determine how dairy cows are sick and infected and how that could have passed to, a worker, a human worker. And so you guys are talking this great talk about working together, but according to the reporters, they're saying CDC can't even get in to investigate. And I hear also that the USDA is asking permission to test workers, and they say, no, you can't, because that could be a PR nightmare for us. And we might, that would be really bad for business. And the USDA says, oh, okay, then we won't test. Well, it's the Wild West out there.
Yeah. There's only one interest really driving them, and it's just keep doing more business, keep growing. Yeah. That's pretty much it.
So it's a situation to me that begs to be exposed and has to be, it's something that we're trying to get more, even independent media, more interested in the topic, because a lot of the progressives here that should be covering this as part of their repertoire of subjects, and yes, cover the wars and cover what's going on, but also this is a big issue that affects lots of animals, but also lots of people, and it's going to affect people the most disenfranchised the most.
As always. Well, Robert, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation before we wrap up? But also, what's the best way of people supporting your work, following Free From Harm, even buying your book?
We're trying to create a network of people that is a community that relies on each other, that supports each other. So you can join our community, freefromharm.org/sign up, I believe it is. Yeah, sign up. It's on the homepage too, the button to sign up, and that'll get you into our list, and you'll become aware of the different kind of programs you can get involved in.
That's great. Thank you.
We're trying what we're trying to do with people is to help them get active with their own congressional reps. They're eventually going to have to vote on the Farm Bill. So whether they're involved in shaping the legislation or not, eventually they can speak about it, and they're going to have to vote on it. So get them primed now that you don't support this current system, and we can help people in that process and support them in that way.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well, like I say, I'll include the links in the show notes too. But it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. And again, it's brilliant to have you as a subscriber too. So thank you for that.
Jamie. It's been great to be on the show.
Been wonderful to have you as a guest on Sentientism. Thank you. And please do stay in touch.
Will do.
Cheers, Robert.